Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. And on these weekly mini episodes, we bring you bite-sized ideas for you to snack on.
Like breathing exercises, book reviews. Maybe we'll review some scientific research, or we'll share some wellness and fertility stories from our listeners.
So if you're looking for a tip or a trick related to your fertility and well-being, then you've come to the right place.
Let's dig in. Hey, what's good, everybody? Happy Thursday, and welcome back to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris, and I'm recording solo today. Anne has been called away for some professional superhero nurse practitioner duties and can't join us, but I promise I will do my best to be as witty and charming and knowledgeable as her, so wish me luck. But we do have a really good, wonderful discussion today, super fascinating, and I'm so happy to welcome back Katy Bradbury. She's a nurse and a nutrition therapist working in private practice in London who specializes in whole person women's health care across the lifespan, including fertility. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to her main episode last week, definitely go back and check that out as well. Thank you so much for being with us again.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So today we are talking about the vaginal microbiome, which I think a lot of people are going to be like, say what?
Yeah.
So we've talked about the gut microbiome on several occasions on this podcast, especially with Dr. Will Bulsiewicz last fall. So we know that there are microbes in our gut that help and are integral to our health, but in our vaginas?
It is mind-blowing, isn't it? And I, it's funny you say that about the gut microbiome, because when you work in this field and it becomes part of your everyday language, I'm always surprised by the amount of people, clients, who have no idea what the microbiome is, gut microbiome or any microbiome, because for me, it seems so obvious. And I would always stop myself and say, do you know what I mean when I say microbiome? And 9 times out of 10, it's no. For me, it's just endlessly fascinating, and I forget that terminology isn't out in the big wide world yet.
Yeah, I totally forget that not everyone's such a nerd as I am when it comes to this kind of stuff. And I'm like, oh wait, yes, back up. Not everybody talks about, bacteria in people's intestines every day.
Right.
So maybe we should start there. Let's just talk about what a microbiome is.
Because the most well-known microbiome, I guess, is the gut microbiome. I always say it's almost like an internal organ of its own right, because I can never remember the exact numbers on this, and so I end up making it up. But it's a powerful number. The bacteria in our gut outnumber our own human cells by, I can't remember, but it's something like 100 to 1 or even 1,000 to 1. Like we are more bacteria than we are our own human cells. And over the course of human history and other animals, because we're not alone in having a gut microbiota, it's evolved with us. And so it's learnt, we have learnt to live symbiotically. And so we are host to these vast swathes of bacteria. And I know that bacteria sounds scary, and, we live in this kind of massive anti-bac culture where we're, wanting to buy products that get rid of 99.9% of germs and all the rest of it. And so we very much have learnt to fear germs, but actually bacteria a lot of the time is not just harmless, but helpful to our health. And so it's become this symbiotic relationship where we host the bacteria and they do nice things for us. But in some cases, they do not so nice things for us. And so that's when we start to talk about imbalances in the gut microbiome, or dysbiosis is the terminology that we sometimes use. And we know that things like diet, like lifestyle, and so lots and lots of factors that we're exposed to in the modern world today have shifted that microbiome to be more inflammatory in nature, and shifted the species that are living within us to not quite such a beneficial picture. And I guess the field of the microbiome is still relatively new in terms of scientific history, and it's a very exciting field, and there's more and more research going into it, and we're learning more by the year. So it is super exciting, and I don't think any one of us can proclaim to be a true expert, because we're still asking questions. But the more we learn, the more exciting it becomes.
Yeah, for sure. Like if you would have asked me when I was like going through nursing school, if I would be talking about all the bacteria in our gut and how important they are, like 15 years later, I'm like, really? Okay. I think some people don't even realize that there are good and bad bacteria and that our bugs in our gut, basically the bacteria in our gut, there are certain ones that are beneficial and then others that are not. So that's where that dysbiosis happens, is where the, ones that are not so helpful overtake the ones that are, and that's where problems can arise.
Yeah, exactly. And there's different tiers and different levels to it, right? So we know that if someone had a really nasty infection in their gut, so had food poisoning, for example, that comes from some bad bacteria that has somehow got into your gut, probably from something that you've eaten. And so we're familiar with that as a concept. But what happens when there's a bit more of a low level? Because some of the bacteria is not necessarily pathogenic in nature. It's not going to give you, it's not going to put you into a disease state necessarily, or not straight away anyway. But it's opportunistic in nature. And I always describe it similarly to, certainly with the gut microbiome, where we want there to be a broad diversity of microbes, is it's like a garden and it's like grass in a garden. And what we find here, or certainly what I find in my garden, is if there are patches in the grass where that grass isn't growing prolifically, then a weed will crop up. Always, right? Because weeds are opportunistic in nature, and they will find, if there is space, then they'll be like, yippee, I'm going to grow here. And it's the same in our gut microbiome. If it's not really filled to the brim, if every single millimetre of that surface area, because our large intestine has got a large surface area, if all of that is not populated by the good beneficial bacteria, then the opportunistic bacteria will proliferate. They'll find a way to get in there.
I am so stealing that garden. That's perfect. So how do we prevent the weeds from taking over the garden then?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess now would perhaps be a good time to shift the focus more into the vaginal microbiome sphere, because the two environments are different. And what we want in the gut microbiome is slightly different to what we want to see in the vaginal tract. Now, if you have a vagina, you will know that those two areas are close together, right? They are body parts that exist right next to one another. And so there can, if you like, be cross-contamination from one to the other. And so a lot of the time our kind of basic hygiene comes into play when it comes to the vaginal tract. Like, these things that we learnt when we were younger, like wipe from front to back, right? Those things can make a big difference, because we don't necessarily want the bacteria from our gut to be populating in the vaginal tract, because whilst the gut, we want there to be a real diversity of bacteria in the gut microbiome, in the vagina, we do want there to be plenty of the right kind of bacteria, but the right kind of bacteria is much, much more narrow. And the right kind of bacteria that we want to see in the vaginal tract is an overarching species called Lactobacilli. And there are lots of different subspecies within that. The Lactobacilli are a good bacteria in our gut as well. But really in the vaginal tract, we don't really want to see much more other than the Lactobacilli. Some healthy vaginal tracts can have a little bit of diversity and a little bit of variation without causing issue. But generally speaking, that's what we want to see in that vaginal tract. And so if there is, for example, not enough of the Lactobacilli, what happens is that then can create room for others to come in. And the reason that does that specifically in the vaginal tract is because the Lactobacilli produce a substance, so the lacto, they produce a substance called lactic acid. That starts to create a slightly acidic environment in the vagina. And that acidic environment is the thing that is protective against some of those other more detrimental species coming in and taking up home there.
Why do we care what bacteria are there? Why do we care if our neighbors are no longer, Lactobacilli? There are others that are moving in.
The reason that we care about that, and especially from a women's health point of view, and even more especially from a fertility point of view, is that we're learning more and more every year about this, but there are associations between that vaginal microbiome and pregnancy outcomes. So it can be associated with pregnancy loss, also things like preterm birth and other detrimental pregnancy outcomes like that. It can influence infertility and the ability to get pregnant. We are now learning more about links between the vaginal microbiome and endometriosis and those associations. So all of these possible hurdles to getting and staying pregnant. So that's really why it matters. And that's why we want to try and create an environment vaginally that is hosting these lactobacilli and keeping the environment in this mildly acidic state and warding off anything that could be causing problems to reproductive health.
Yeah. And even if you aren't in that stage of your life where you are trying to conceive or you're having fertility issues, it puts you at higher risk for certain infections, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So really common infections that we would see in the vaginal tract would be with bacteria associated with BV, so bacterial vaginosis, and yeast infections as well, right? Like thrush. They're uncomfortable. They're not, they're not nice to live
no one
with.
Likes those.
Right? They're not pleasant. But when we're talking about some of these passageways being close to one another physiologically, you've got the urinary tract as well. And so vaginal dysbiosis can also come hand in hand with urinary tract infections as well. And, if there's E. coli, which is the most common UTI, urinary tract infection associated bacteria, then if that is prolific in the vaginal tract, then a lot of the time we see recurrent UTIs in that person. And that is again, a really, really horrible condition to have to live with. Also, we are in, I guess, kind of its infancy in terms of scientific research, but on the edge of learning more about the way that our vaginal microbiome interacts with that estrogen, right? And it's important to note that with estrogen, there are estrogen receptors in every single cell of the body. We think of estrogen as a sex hormone, but actually it's a whole body hormone.
Anybody who's going through menopause understands that there is estrogen receptors in every single cell, because for some reason, menopause, for that reason, actually, that why menopause is so, whole body involved.
Absolutely. And so if you are going into those perimenopausal years, then the vaginal microbiome might be something that you want to consider as well.
So we put you at higher risk for infection, but also like sexually transmitted infections, higher susceptibility for those things. I've actually recently have heard that the science is now looking at the microbiome in the uterus. So, those are all connected, and that might be related to implantation. We just don't know yet, but it's all fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. And that endometrial microbiome picture is one. I have a few clients who have had that looked at medically as part of recurrent miscarriage. They're all so close together. And yes, the STI picture as well, if that vaginal microbiome isn't in that protective space, then you are more susceptible to STIs. And of course, then STIs can impact reproductive health as well.
Absolutely. Now, what are the things that we can do to impact our vaginal microbiome? Just kind of like we can kind of tweak our gut microbiome.
Just basic vaginal hygiene is so important here. And we spoke last week in some of our discussions about shame that comes in with regards to food choices and body image and all of these things. And I do think that there is shame when it comes to talking about vaginal health as well. And
Sure.
I do have clients who use all sorts of cleaning products in that region because they don't want it to smell. And if you're using a lot of chemical products in that area, you are going to be disrupting your vaginal microbiome and actually then making it even more likely that you would be hosting bacterial vaginosis associated bacteria, which can then drive that kind of that odorous environment. So it turns into a bit of a catch-22. But I would say that, look, really, really strong reminder, or perhaps if you didn't know already, listeners, that the vagina is self-cleaning. It is internal for a reason, right? And so when we talk about the vagina here, we're talking about the whole area. We're talking about the labia as well, right? We're not just talking about the vaginal tract. It's really important to note that really we only need to clean that area with water. And anything else could be stripping the pH. Even products that claim to be pH friendly and all the rest of it. And, don't even get me started on like these sprays and deodorizing
There's
products.
There's a huge market for this kind of stuff. It's if you walk down the aisle for this, you're like, how are there this many things? Are we still advertising this for people? It's just so detrimental. And the fact that like you're mentioning that society makes us think that we need these things when our body is perfectly capable of managing those things on its own.
Absolutely. And then it's things like what I mentioned before about wiping front to back and trying not to get any fecal matter contaminating the vaginal tract or that area. The type of underwear that we wear can make a difference. So, I'm a massive advocate of cotton underwear. And we know that thongs and G-strings can, again, because it's that passage and, a thong can go into your buttocks, right? And then if it rubs, then naturally it's going to be impacting that vaginal area. And then it's things like diet as well. So we know that the food that we eat impacts the gut microbiome, but the food that we eat, it feeds, it's not just feeding us, it is feeding the bacteria that live in our body as well. And we know that the range of the level of ultra processed foods that we have nowadays and sugary foods, these and foods that you just have to walk 2 minutes outside your front door, or certainly here, to find those kind of foods in abundance, right? And in the supermarket, you find those foods in like every second aisle of the supermarket. Like, it never ceases to amaze me that in my supermarket, there is an entire aisle just for chocolate. There's an entire aisle just for sweets or candy, as you guys would call it, right?
And there's potato chips and
there's a whole aisle for the potato chips. There's a whole aisle for different cereals. It's mind-blowing to me.
There's definitely not a whole aisle for different kinds of lettuce, for sure. Right? Like there's a few, but definitely not a whole aisle.
I can't tell you how excited I'd be if there was a whole aisle.
All the different kind of variations. And oh man, that would be great. Microgreens. Yes, for that. Yeah. And so you'd be forgiven for thinking that those foods are should be in your diet because they're everywhere. But the truth is they don't feed a healthy microbiome, and especially microorganisms like yeasts are very classic for feeding off of sugar and glucose. And a lot of the time, when I'm looking at the vaginal microbiome, candida, which is a type of fungal infection, that is there sitting in the vaginal tract. And, ideally we don't want that to be there. We talked a little bit in our last episode. We briefly mentioned the estrobolome and how our microbiome can impact our hormone production and how we metabolize of different hormones. Does that also impact, is it impacted by the vaginal microbiome as well?
Yes, it is. And again, so much of this is in its infancy, but what we're finding now is that some of the women's health or the women's female reproductive conditions like endometriosis that I mentioned before and like PCOS, there are commonalities there around our estrogen levels, right? And so it's estrogen's a great hormone. I love estrogen, but it's when it's out of balance or if it's not countered by progesterone. So a menstruating person is cyclical in nature if they've got a healthy menstrual cycle. And how that works is that in the second half of the cycle, progesterone will be released. And then that is the thing that helps to bring that cycle back around. And so when estrogen is left unchecked, so if ovulation hasn't occurred or if our estrogen is metabolizing down a pathway that is inflammatory in nature, or we are not, even something as simple as we're not opening our bowels regularly enough because our estrogen is cleared out of our system by bowel motions, right? Partly.
Yeah, I don't think people realize that. That's how we manage our estrogen levels. It's actually excreted through our gut. So I don't think people realize. So constipation is major issue because you can reabsorb some of that estrogen and then you have imbalance. So we're back to the gut.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, everything always comes back to the gut, right? With these links of how estrogen interacts with our immune system, and then which is connected to the bacteria that live in our gut, because the bacteria that live in our gut can elicit an immune response. And with estrogen's interaction with every cell in our body, like we spoke about before, the fact that there are estrogen receptors on every cell in our body, it just makes sense that we need to focus on the right kind of bacteria, the bacteria that we know are beneficial and that support that estrogen metabolism, compared to bacteria that are inflammatory in nature, because inflammation is part of the immune system. And then we come back into that immune response, which estrogen is a part of. So there's just so many mini cycles of connection within it all, that actually it's kind of turns into a bit of a chicken and egg scenario of where do we actually begin here? And the truth is, so much of the body and the systems in the body are connected. You just have to start somewhere, right? You start somewhere and then you build, but the principles remain the same. Like it's what we put into our bodies. It's how we excrete. And it's, like the stresses and strain and the emotional side of things. So it's all of those foundations will always be the things that we come back to.
Yeah. And, talking about things that influence our microbiome in our gut and like the balance, I imagine contraception or hormones, like external hormones that we take, like oral contraceptive pills and things like that, could probably impact our balance in some way, as important as they are.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And this is one of those situations, isn't it, where the female rights person in me is like, yes, for contraception, and the healthcare practitioner in me is like, oh gosh, synthetic hormones for like years and years and years. It's like it can be so problematic. And I wish that there was as much like research that had gone into women's health over the decades as, had gone into like Viagra research or something, because if it was men that had to deal with this kind of thing, then we would have found a solution for contraception a long time ago that actually was working really well. Not to say that the pill doesn't work well as contraception, but it has its pitfalls. And we know that synthetic hormones, they're going to impact that. I'm not aware of any explicit research that's been done on this, and I would love to see it, around what a vaginal microbiome looks like for someone who is and has been on the oral contraceptive pill for a long time versus someone that then comes off of the oral contraceptive pill. That is really interesting to me, because it is going to impact it. Because if we're thinking about that estrogen influence over every cell in the body and how that interacts with the microbes that live in our body, then it matters. And it's a whole world that's just so interesting for me and fascinating.
There's so many facets to it. There's so many influencing factors, and it's probably not just the pill, like the more local contraceptive, like an IUD or something that's progesterone, or progesterone implants, and it all probably impacts things in different ways. It's so important for women to have their choices and how they manage their contraception and what's best for their body. And sometimes it does take a little trial and error. I always say this when I have a patient who's on oral contraceptive pill and having side effects. It's like, I really wish there was like a blood test that I could do that says like, this is the combination of hormones that your body needs, that you're going to tolerate the best. Unfortunately, maybe someday if we actually focused research on it, then we could get there. But I mean, I guess I should be grateful that we're not on the same dosage of hormones we were when the birth control pill first came out, which is like outrageous.
It's another soapbox, isn't it, that we could get on?
Yeah, just come on up here with me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So almost like everything we're exposed to, what we do can impact every cell in our body and every bacteria in our body, from our skin to our gut to our vaginas. And it can get a little overwhelming to realize that that's the case. Do you have any advice for people for how to keep their microbiome the healthiest? We've talked about it a little bit.
So coming back to those basic principles are really important. And in my clinical practice, I do run vaginal microbiome screening. So I don't run it for everybody, but there are certain clinical indications for which I would definitely run it, like recurrent miscarriage. I would always look at the vaginal microbiome then. And also just like long-term infertility, or if someone has had rounds of IVF and like implantation failure over and over again, I'd be thinking about the vaginal microbiome. But I guess if you're listening to this and you're worried and you're kind of like, oh, well, I don't really know like how I would go about that. I mean, there are some great companies over there in the States as well that do vaginal microbiome testing. But one thing that you can do quite easily yourself as like a little check-in is check the pH of your vagina. And so you can buy pH test strips. And it's just like almost a litmus test, right? And so you can check, because the thing that I spoke about before about those Lactobacilli, which is the type of bacteria we want to see prolific in the vaginal tract, the reason they are protective is because they produce that lactic acid. And so we want the vaginal pH to be sitting between 3.5 and 4.5 ideally. And if your vaginal tract is sitting up at 5.5, for example, then it might be a sign that actually there isn't enough of those lactic acid producing bacteria in your vaginal tract. And so it might then open up a line of inquiry for you. There are a whole host of topical interventions that I recommend for clients, and sometimes that can be as simple using, like you guys probably have it, I don't know if you would have it by the same name, but using a lactulose solution, because lactulose is lactic acid. But I wouldn't ever recommend using lactulose topically unless you actually have had things checked out and you know. But there are things that we can do to shift that environment so that it then is mimicking the environment that we want to be, so that we can then have more of an uptake of the bacteria that we want to see and a downregulation of the species that we don't want. Similarly, there are strains of probiotics that are found to be really helpful in a healthy vagina, because probiotics are bacteria. And so you're taking something that is known to then help to proliferate. And you can get women's health focused probiotics that contain certain species. So species like L. rhamnosus and L. reuteri, they are both species that have been researched to help with that vaginal tract and to create that healthier balance of bacteria in the vaginal tract. So, there are probiotics that can help as well. We spoke about supplements previously, and I wouldn't ever just recommend doing that off the back of listening to a podcast like this, because it's, you're talking about something that has a very fine balance. The balance can be, very easily tipped one way or another. And there are vaginal tracts that are overpopulated with lactobacilli, right? And that can create its own problems and cause inflammation. And so I want to be able to give you all of the answers on a show like this. So much of it just depends on your clinical situation.
Yeah, that's so important to mention, because oftentimes when we hear things like this, we're like, well, more has to be better. And oftentimes that's not the case. So it is important to if you're worried about these things, talk to somebody who is knowledgeable about it and maybe get some testing done. If you feel like you're having like recurrent infections or something like that, is totally a reasonable thing to check out for sure. And I'm going to kind of take it back to the beginning of the episode just to end here. And we mentioned antibacterial and antibiotics and how we are very anti-germ these days, which has been helpful in the, in the last couple of years when it comes to COVID and things like that. But how is that not helping us in terms of our microbiota?
This conversation always brings me back to a chat that I had with one of my lecturers in my first degree, because I studied anthropology originally. In one of my evolutionary anthropology lectures, we spent some time talking about the hygiene hypothesis. And the hygiene hypothesis is linking this culture that we have in the modern world of being really fearful of bacteria and cleaning everything to the nth degree and making sure that everything is super duper clean, and connecting that to the rise of allergies and the rise of atopic conditions, which I know is a little bit of a side note from what you actually asked me, but it's interesting to me because it's almost as though we've become so fixated on, and it's the balance piece, right? We've become so fixated on cleanliness. And that, in some respects, has served us really well, because 500 years ago, people were dying from infections that are completely preventable now, and people were living in in squalor, and there was no hygiene, and it was awful, and people were dying way before their years. Thankfully, we're not there anymore, and people tend to be dying, at least in the Western world nowadays, from non-communicable diseases and from metabolic diseases and those
lifestyle-related things.
Right,
Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's a balance, right? It's like, okay, yes, we want to be clean, like, we do want to be clean, and that has served us well, but we don't want to be sterile. Because if we're sterile, then where does that leave us in terms of these not just the bacteria that are good for us in our microbiome, but the bacteria that we need to be exposed to for our immune system? Because if we're not exposed to anything, and, again, this hygiene hypothesis talks about, kids who grow up in like farms in Sweden who have no allergies, versus kids that grew up in households where like everything is wiped down 100 times a day, and, much more likely to develop allergies and general intolerances to the environment because their immune system just can't handle it. And so I think that it's another passionate topic for me, but it's really important that we get that balance right, and not to be fearful of bacteria, and know that bacteria actually do have a really important role to play in human health.
Yeah, I think that's the theme for the episode is balance. There is so much balance when it comes to these things. And one thing that can throw off balance are antibiotics. And they, again, centuries ago, we died of infections. So when penicillin was discovered, that was a huge thing because it saved lives. So antibiotics are incredibly important, but they do influence the good bacteria in our body as well, which can be detrimental. So it all is about trying to bring things back into balance if we do have something that tips it in one direction or the other, and that's going to happen.
Yeah, massively. And yeah, I mean, the antibiotic piece, it's like, I don't know how it is over there, but over here, antibiotics are often just when really the clinical indication sometimes isn't there. And I think that clinicians can be stuck between a rock and a hard place, because one thing we spoke about in the previous episode was the fact that primary care physicians over here get like 7 minutes to do a consult. And so it's, a lot of the time it is just like, oh, well, okay, here you go. I'll write the script and off you go. And also, a lot of the time it's, people thinking that that's what they need. If they're sick, you have antibiotics. And actually, that is massively contributing to drug-resistant diseases worldwide on a global scale. And also, in terms of our internal composition, it wipes your microbiome, right? If you have antibiotics, they are there to kill the microbes, and antibiotics don't know whether they're killing your good bacteria or your bad bacteria. They are wiping the slate clean. And so a lot of the time I see bacteria where, I mean, we spoke before about an overgrowth of, either pathogenic or opportunistic bacteria. But one of the most common things I see is just a real depletion of the commensal bacteria, the grass on the lawn that we want to be growing. And a lot of the time that is because of recurrent antibiotic use.
Yeah, I think we touched on all the things that I wanted to talk about, the vaginal microbiome, the microbiota in general. I could talk to you about this for a long time because it's just fascinating. There's so many ways that it's influenced and influences other things. But Anne's going to just tease me about this not being a snack episode because I keep talking.
Yeah, okay, we need to.
But it was so lovely to have you on. Thank you for being with us. The last 2 episodes have been just fascinating and so helpful. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's been such a pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.